Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we sail into a neat triangle on the map between Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan. This patch of ocean has gathered more rumors than almost any other. We will check the famous cases and the plain forces at work here. Busy sea lanes, fast currents, sudden squalls, and very human mistakes. If there is a mystery, we will let the facts speak. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are settling into bed or letting your mind drift for a while, I am glad you are here. Now, let us begin. Picture the western North Atlantic as a grand room with 3 bright pins stuck into a map. Miami on the Florida peninsula, Bermuda out in the mid-ocean, and San Juan on the island of Puerto Rico. Draw lines between those points, and you have the working outline of the Bermuda Triangle. It is not an official place. No authority patrols its borders, and you will not find a warning label on nautical charts. It is a nickname for a very busy, very changeable piece of sea that happens to sit where North America meets the tropics. Depending on how you trace the sides, it covers something like the area of Texas, give or take. That is a lot of water, and a lot of weather. The corners each bring their own character. Miami faces the Florida Straits, a narrow corridor where Atlantic water squeezes past the Keys toward the Gulf of Mexico. San Juan fronts the open Atlantic just beyond the eastern end of the Greater Antilles. Bermuda is a lonely summit of volcanic rock capped by coral hundreds of miles from the nearest mainland. Between them lie the Bahama Banks, a maze of pale, shallow shelves and darker, deep cuts that have tested sailors since the age of candles and canvas. In the northwest is the Straits of Florida, to the east the wide Atlantic, and in the middle a shelf edge that drops away with surprising abruptness. The seafloor here is a patchwork of ledges, escarpments, and trenches, including the Puerto Rico Trench, which plunges to well over 5 miles deep. A modern aircraft or ship that slips into that abyss can be very hard to find. If the seabed is dramatic, the surface is restless. The Gulf Stream is the great mover in this story. It is a warm current born in the Caribbean that races through the Straits of Florida and bends north along the United States coast. In places, it flows at highway speeds for a swimmer, several knots or more, a river within the sea that never rests. Anything floating in it, whether a life ring or a plank of wood, can be carried far from the point of trouble in a few hours. To search and rescue planners, this matters. A delay of even an hour can turn a tight search box into a wide quilt that stretches toward the open Atlantic. Weather is the next central fact. This is a meeting ground of air masses. In winter, cold fronts slide off the continent and spark squalls over the warm water. In summer, the subtropical high sits to the east like a vast blue dome and pumps trade winds across the islands. Afternoon, towers of cloud rise from the sea and collapse into sharp rain and strong gusts. Waterspouts are not rare. From June to November, tropical storms and hurricanes track through these latitudes, some roaring straight across the Bahamas, others curving near Bermuda. Many days are postcard calm, but changes can be swift, and a clear morning is no guarantee of an easy afternoon. To mariners of earlier centuries, the Bahamas were a blessing and a curse. The Great Bahama Bank looks like a lagoon the size of a small country, but its shallow sand plains and coral heads are unkind to a heavy keel. Before modern charts and depth sounders, captains picked their way by eye. Even with good light, a squall could blind a watch for minutes, and minutes were enough. Names on charts tell the story. Memory Rock, Gingerbread Ground, Tongue of the Ocean. That last one is a deep channel that runs between Andros Island and New Providence, a long blue trench flanked by very shallow banks. It offers a protected route, but take the wrong cut and you meet hard limestone. Navigation brings us to another detail people have repeated for generations. Compasses do not point to true north. They point to magnetic north, and the amount of offset is called declination. The line of zero declination, the agonic line, has wandered over the centuries. At times it has run through this region. If you did not account for that, especially in the days before electronic systems, your course could drift by degrees that matter over long legs. Add cloud that hides the sun and stars, a bit of fatigue, and a strong current pushing you sideways, and you can see how an ordinary passage becomes a puzzle. Now expand the view above the sea. The sky over the triangle is one of the busiest in the world. Flights connect Florida with the Caribbean and South America. Bermuda acts as a stepping stone on transatlantic routes and as a destination of its own. Pilots speak of strong trade winds, of clear air that can turn hazy without warning, of embedded showers that hide in apparently simple stratus. In the early years of aviation, radios were temperamental and navigation aids were sparse once you left the coast. A modern cockpit has redundancies and satellite fixes that update many times a minute. A crew in the late 1940s often had a compass, an airspeed indicator, a clock, and dead reckoning. If your compass became suspect and your horizon grew patchy in rain, you had decisions to make. Beneath all this movement lives a floating landscape that fooled even seasoned hands. Sailors from Europe first reported brown mats that seemed to form islands in the deep ocean. This is the Sargasso Sea, a slow gyre east of the Bahamas, named for a genus of seaweed that drifts on the surface. It is not a still lake as some old engravings show, but there are wide reaches of languid water with long lines of weed and blue water in between. Eels spawn in its quiet central waters before their young drift back to Europe and North America. Fish hide under the mats. For a ship without wind, it could feel like a spell, but the real story is more interesting than any legend. The Sargasso Sea overlaps the eastern side of the triangle and is part of the same great system of currents that includes the Gulf Stream. Human use is the final piece that turns geography into risk. On a map, this triangle sits at the crossroads of trade. Cargo ships pass from the Gulf of Mexico and the Panama Canal to the Atlantic. Cruise ships shuttle between Florida and the Bahamas and down to the Lesser Antilles. Fishing boats work the banks. Small private craft hug the Florida coast or hop to Bimini and back in a day. Airliners and cargo jets draw crisscrossing lines overhead. With that much traffic, a certain number of mishaps are baked into the statistics. The sheer volume means more incidents are recorded here than in lonely oceans where few people travel, and that can give the area an outsized reputation. None of this is to strip away the sense of curiosity. Part of the reason the Bermuda Triangle captured the imagination is that it collects interesting contrasts. Very shallow water lies next to very deep water. Peaceful mornings can go to pieces by 3 in the afternoon. A sparkling sea can hide a fast river beneath it. Ancient reefs built by living things can wreck modern steel. Many famous cases that people remember took place within these edges, and it is sensible to understand the setting before we step into the stories. When we say the triangle, we are really talking about a corner of the Atlantic where nature is lively and people move in great numbers. If you want numbers, you can put rough bounds on it. Between about 18 and 32 degrees north, and between about 66 and 80 degrees west, you cover most of the common definitions. Inside those numbers are the Florida Straits, the Providence Channels, the Exuma Sound, the tongue of the ocean, the deep plain that falls away toward the trench, and the open water that leads on to the Sargasso Sea. That is the stage on which all the accounts to come take place, from early logbooks to radio calls that cut out mid-sentence. Once you see the stage clearly, many of the props fall naturally into place. So, Chapter 1 begins, not with a curse, but with a map. A triangle drawn across strong currents and shifting weather and complicated topography, heavy with ships and aircraft, and storied by 5 centuries of travelers. That is quite enough to merit attention even before a single mystery enters the scene. It is the kind of place where stories can grow because the setting is rich and the conditions vary from hour to hour. In the following part, we will look at the earliest reports that gave this region its air of oddness and set the tone for later generations. The first written hints that the waters within our triangle could unsettle even the hardiest sailors come from a journal kept in a cramped cabin in the autumn of 1492. Christopher Columbus crossed the western Atlantic that year with a crew who had never been so far from the known world. On September 13, he noted with puzzlement that the compass on the Santa Maria was no longer lining up with the pole star as expected. The needle drifted. To us, that is a tidy demonstration of magnetic variation. To men who had trusted the sky and the compass as their 2 most faithful guides, it felt like the world itself had shifted. A few weeks later, on the night of October 11, Columbus wrote of a distant light that seemed to flicker and rise and fall near the horizon. The next day brought land, which is the part people remember. The odd light and the odd needle were the details that left a mark in sailors' lore. Columbus and his men also sailed through mats of floating weed so thick that the sea looked quilted. This was the northeast edge of what would later be called the Sargasso Sea, a wide gyre of the Atlantic where currents circulate in a slow oval and the water can seem to idle for days. The weed is sargassum, a brown algae that grows with tiny air bladders that make it float. The first chroniclers from Spain and Portugal described it as if fields had been laid across the ocean. A ship could move through it without trouble. Yet the sight of vast rafts of living plant life in the open sea, coupled with long stretches of light wind, fed uneasy talk among crews. Maps and letters from the 16th century mention a sea where ships might be becalmed and where weed could snare the keel. The fear was not accurate, but it was vivid, and vivid fears tend to travel farther than careful corrections. The Sargasso Sea sits east of the Bahamas and north of the Antilles, overlapping the eastern side of our triangle. It is not a single patch. It is a basin where the great clockwise circulation of the North Atlantic gathers drifts and weed into long lines, called windrows, that can run for miles. The water there is famously clear. Sailors could look down and see a blue that is closer to violet than to green, with sunlight striking many fathoms below. You might think still water means safety, but to a wooden ship that needed wind, the quiet could feel like a trap. Provisions ran out more quickly when speed fell to a crawl. Fresh water grew stale. Tempers did not improve. From these slow days came talk of dead calms and strange seas. Later ages grafted those impressions onto the triangle, as if the calm at the center were kin to the vanishings at the edges. Nature was at work in more interesting ways. Eels from Europe and North America both spawn in the Sargasso Sea. Their young ride currents back to rivers, as if returning on invisible conveyor belts. Fish shelter under the sargassum mats. Turtles feed there. Birds hunt there. Whales migrate along the margins. None of this is eerie. It is a busy ecological crossroad that early mariners could not fully see but could sense. They watched birds appear far from land and wondered what drew them. They hauled nets and found shrimps and crabs among the weed. Over time, practical knowledge softened the stories. Captains learned that weed lines could mark current edges, and that current edges sometimes marked the best fishing. If we shift westward from the open gyre to the island arc, we meet another route of the early legends. Few coasts in the Atlantic have more shipwrecks than the reefs that ring Bermuda and the shoals that speckle the Bahamas. The Spanish called Bermuda the Islands of Devils, a name that likely came from the unearthly sounds made by birds and wind in the caves, and from the way hidden coral labored to chew the bottoms from passing ships. In 1609, the flagship sea venture of the Virginia Company fleet drove onto Bermuda's eastern reefs in a hurricane. The 150 people aboard survived, lived through a winter on that lonely land, and then built two smaller vessels called Deliverance and Patience to finish the journey to Jamestown. Their story inspired parts of Shakespeare's Tempest, and it fixed Bermuda in English imagination as a place where storms and reefs could both wreck and save. By the 18th century, New Providence in the Bahamas had become the unofficial capital of Atlantic piracy. The channels between the islands, with their complex shoals and clear shallows, made ambush and escape practical for small, fast craft. Names like Blackbeard and Calico Jack hook modern audiences, but to merchants of the time they were more than theater. Disappearances in this region during that period often had a human cause, though a vanished ship looks the same on a ledger, whether it met a reef or a cutlass. Later writers sometimes folded those losses into a single fog of mystery. The truth is a mosaic. Reefs, storms, and pirates each took a share. The Bahamas also had a long tradition of wrecking. That word sounds sinister, but much of it was legal salvage. Bahamians in islands like Abaco and Eleuthera kept watch for stranded ships after gales and sold what could be recovered under rules set by courts. Some were undoubtedly tempted to light false beacons in bad weather. Most did not, because communities live by reputation. Still, stories of men luring ships to ruin traveled. Add those tales to the already fearsome roster of reefs, and you begin to see how the region earned the reputation of a place that eats hulls. Weather contributed its own pageantry. Mariners spoke of St. Elmo's fire, a faint blue glow that forms on masts and yardarms during electrical storms. Sailors had seen it in the Mediterranean and in the Indian Ocean. They saw it here as well. It is a harmless effect of ionized air, but to a crew in a squall at night, it would have felt like the sea and sky were alive with signals. They also saw the sea glow. Bioluminescent plankton bloom across the tropical Atlantic and create trails of light in the ship's wake. A helmsman with a dark horizon and a luminous wake could be forgiven for thinking the ocean had moods. Navigation mistakes were common, and there were reasons. Longitude was difficult to fix at sea until accurate marine chronometers became widely available in the late 18th century. John Harrison's clock solved the problem in principle, but it took decades before every working vessel had reliable timekeeping. Before that, dead reckoning and celestial fixes guided most ships. Cloud cover could blot out sun and stars for days at a time. Currents like the Florida Current and the Antilles Current could set a vessel far from its intended track without leaving any mark except a change in the pattern of the swell. The combination of uncertain longitude, variable current, and frequent squalls created fertile ground for mistakes that later storytellers could recast as mysteries. The Sargasso Sea acquired its own set of yarns as the age of sail rolled on. Captains spoke of derelicts drifting out of the weed with lines hanging and no one aboard. Some of these accounts are surely embroidered. A few are documented. The Atlantic is a big ocean, and any sea will have a share of abandoned hulls. The idea that the Sargasso kept them trapped like flies in amber was romantic rather than literal. Currents do converge there, but ships are not preserved on the surface for months without being noticed, boarded, or sunk by weather. The truth was more mundane. A storm or a leak could force a crew to take to the boats. The hull might then drift, and if a passing ship found it weeks later, the empty deck told a simple and sad story. One thread that often gets pulled into triangle lore is the Mary Celeste. She was found in 1872 under partial sail near the Azores, with her cargo intact and her crew gone. That was thousands of miles away from our triangle, but the Atlantic is a single stage in the public mind, and a good ghost ship story tends to be borrowed freely. In the 19th century, newspapers were fond of colorful details. When 20th century writers assembled their anthologies of uncanny episodes, they favored the shivers over the footnotes. The result was an anthology effect. Events separated by centuries and by oceans were placed in a neat cluster. The Sargasso lent a ready backdrop, and the triangle later offered a tidy frame. For sailors who worked these waters every season, the legends carried lessons even when the details were wrong. A captain leaving Nassau for Charleston learned to respect the Providence channels with their shifting sand and quick squalls. A navigator on a packet from Bermuda learned to watch the barometer that can drop with quiet decisiveness before a winter gale. A fisherman out of Bimini learned how a brisk morning can turn to a white curtain of rain before lunch. These are not supernatural teachings. They are practical notes written in logbooks and in hard experience. The early chronicles, with their lights and compasses and weed, gave the region an air of strangeness. The working knowledge that followed gave it shape. There is one more way that early stories primed the world for what came later. The Western Atlantic is full of thresholds, shoal to deep, calm to squall, trade wind to frontal wind. That constant crossing of boundaries produces sights and sounds that stick in memory. A sailor who first sees the water in the tongue of the ocean after weeks of green banks will remember that impossible blue. A lookout who hears long rolling surf on a dark night and knows only later that it was breaking on a reef will not forget the relief or the fear. The human mind stitches such moments together. When, in later centuries, modern losses occurred within the same broad space, people were ready to see a pattern. The Sargasso Sea and the early legends do not prove that the Bermuda Triangle is haunted by anything other than history and geography. They do explain why a region with ordinary causes could gather extraordinary stories. Calm seas that strained patience, reefs that punished a moment's lapse, currents that moved wreckage away from the scene before anyone could chart a search, electrical displays that lit rigging like candles. All of it real, and all of it unusual enough to leave a trace in the language of the ocean. With that groundwork laid, we can turn from the broad theatre to the cast. The 19th century leaves us a ledger of vessels that never arrived, and a few derelicts that did, and those cases mark the first set of mysteries that later authors would place inside the triangle's lines. If you stand on the deck of a wooden schooner in the year 1800 and look out across the Florida Straits or the channels east of Cuba, you are looking at a working highway. Mail packets, revenue cutters, naval sloops, and brigs hauling sugar and coffee share the water with fishermen and small coasters that jump from island to island. It is busy, and it is unforgiving. Charts are improving but still incomplete. Reefs stand just below the shine of the surface. Squalls can rise from a bright horizon. A navigator reckons position by sun and stars, and by the feel of the sea under the keel. A short misjudgment has long echoes in a logbook. The record of early American naval losses sets the tone. The schooner Pickering was a small government vessel that fought privateers in the Quasi-War and then vanished in the Atlantic in the year 1800, with about 90 people aboard. She sailed from the Caribbean in late summer, that season of warm water and sudden storms, and never reached her northern port. No sighting, no wreckage. Only a stark note in official correspondence that a ship was due and did not appear. A hurricane that year is the likeliest suspect. In the age of sail, a large storm can pass 20 miles away, and you still feel the long heave for days, but you might never see the wall of rain that did the damage. When a ship fails to arrive, families wait for weeks and then for months, while rumors move faster than facts. 14 years later, the sloop of war, Wasp, a lean and accomplished raider of the War of 1812, simply fell silent after a run of victories. The last prize she took was reported by survivors from other ships. After that, nothing. She was last known east of the Caribbean, working the shipping lanes with her guns run out and her crew confident. Then the Atlantic closed over her without leaving a clear clue. The explanations that fit the time are plain. A gale. A sprung seam that began as a trickle and became a race. A mast lost in the wrong moment. The modern mind wants a signal and a position report. The 19th century often provides neither. You are left with weather tables, scattered mentions in port records, and the sober language of naval reports that speak of honor and duty, and not of what the men felt when the sea came aboard in the dark. Another name in those ledgers is Wild Cat, a compact schooner in revenue service lost in 1824 after leaving Cuba. She sailed from Matanzas toward the Florida coast and did not reach it. The Caribbean that year saw violent storms. A small vessel loaded with stores, and men can be as stout as a barrel and still be beaten into failure by a series of breaking seas. A modern reader wants a photograph of wreckage on a beach. What the time gives you is a list of names and payrolls, and an invitation to imagine the last hours without sentiment. It is a reminder that most mysteries at sea begin as a blank patch on a map and remain that way unless luck or currents deliver something to shore. These official losses sit beside stories that spread from the dockside and the galley. One tale out of the mid-century speaks of a French ship called Rosalie, found adrift near the Bahamas under sail with no one aboard. Accounts say she was sound, her cargo intact, the crew apparently gone in an orderly way since boats and papers were missing. You can hear the hush that such a story would create in a waterfront tavern. It combines every anxiety of the working sailor, a sudden event, a decision to abandon, a hull that refuses to sink and drifts on as a silent messenger. Researchers who later went looking for the Rosalie in contemporary lists found thin pickings and conflicting names. There is evidence for a derelict in those waters with a similar name and similar fate, but the crisp details arrive after the fact, which is not how truth usually behaves. Still, even a single true derelict can seed 10 stories, and the Bahamas were a garden for such growth. The best-known yarn from this period is the Ellen Austin, which sailed in 1881 on the New York route and is said to have met an empty ship on the wide Atlantic between the Sargasso and the edge of our triangle. The captain, a practical man, put a prize crew aboard the derelict and arranged to convoy both ships to port. Weather came up, visibility failed. When the fog lifted, the prize was gone. Later, the story says, the Ellen Austin found the same ship again. Once more, the decks were empty. If it sounds like a sea story told to hold an audience past closing time, that is part of its charm. Admirers of the tale have searched shipping, intelligence columns, and company archives for a contemporary mention and have found less than they hoped. The lack does not prove that nothing happened. It does suggest that later retellings gave the story a polish that real life rarely grants. Either way, the image of an obedient ship with no crew turning up twice on the same track has stayed with people who like to think about mysteries. It helps to remember how the region looked to sailors in those decades. Take a schooner out of Nassau and aim for the Providence channels. You run between reef lines and shallows where the color of the water matters more than any marker. In good light, the banks glow and the cuts run deep blue. Late in the day, a squall can force you to shorten sail in a hurry, and the view you needed goes to gray. Farther north, the Florida current presses against the shelf, and the set can move a small ship miles off its intended course overnight. A captain who holds a steady compass course and does not allow for current writes his own surprise in the morning. Many 19th century losses were found later as wreckage on the Bahamas side, when the last known course would have placed them closer to Florida. The current wrote the last chapter and then carried the pages away. Record-keeping was uneven. Lloyd's in London and the great East Coast ports kept excellent lists of arrivals and losses, but smaller islands and Cuban harbors did not always share an impulse for tidy paperwork. A brig clears Havana and promises to call in Charleston. If she goes missing, you may find a short note 6 weeks later that a mast washed up on Abaco, and that is all. The absence of detail is a poor foundation for a grand theory, but later compilers treated it like a signal. When you collect such notices for a century and place them on one small map, you create a heavy cluster that looks like a design even when each dot had its own cause. Hurricanes in the early records explain more than most of the legends allow. The storms that roll off Africa and grow across the Atlantic love warm water, and the Bahamas, the Florida Straits, and the waters east of Puerto Rico are warm for long months. The track charts for the 19th century show plenty of swirls that pass through our triangle. Without satellites, a ship learned of a cyclone when the barometer sank hard and the wind fell strange, or when the swell began to speak of a distant trouble. A few hours of wrong choices in a storm will put even a strong hull into bad water. Many reports of vanishings were dated within days of named storms that are now part of meteorological history. Sailors of the time did not see mystery in this. They saw the working hazard of their trade. There is also the human habit of grouping unlike things. Wrecks on Bermuda's ring of coral belong to the island's own long story. Ships that disappeared south of the Crooked Island Passage belong to the Antilles and to the long curve toward Jamaica. Vessels that left Havana and did not reach Key West were often lost in the straits. Later, writers found it convenient to draw a single set of boundaries and call the whole a special place. The men who sailed it would have described smaller neighborhoods of risk and wisdom. The Providence channels obey their own rules. The tongue of the ocean has its own weather. The old Bahama Channel can be as tricky as any alley in a crowded city. A legend loves a single label. A mariner loves a specific note that says, "Avoid that cut in a northerly." It is worth spending a moment with the ordinary language of the period. When a ship went missing, the phrase used most often was "lost with all hands," short, final. No cause assigned unless wreckage or survivors offered one. The public learned to read those 3 words with a lump in the throat and a shrug. The ocean takes. That was the lesson. What the Bermuda Triangle idea did much later was to take a fair number of those notices from this corner of the Atlantic and present them as a coherent second lesson. Perhaps there was a pattern. Perhaps there was a quality to the water or the sky that deserved a name. The 19th century itself, if you read it straight, is more modest. It shows you fleets passing safely year after year, and it shows you a minority of losses that came where reefs were many and storms were quick. Ghost ships did exist, and this region would see its share. Most of them had straight causes. Fire that forced a crew over the side. A leak that outpaced the pumps. Disease that left too few men to manage a sail plan. Currents that shepherded the empty hull into shipping lanes, where it was found and boarded. The surprise of finding a tidy cabin and a clock still ticking makes a fine paragraph, but the rescue of an abandoned ship was often a matter of business, not romance. Salvage law rewarded calm heads and quick action. Wreckers from the islands made a living from such practicalities and filled court records with their claims. You might ask what any of this proves. It proves that by the end of the century, People had already assembled a small library of disappearing acts inside the lines we now call a triangle. Some were government vessels with firm dates. Some were merchantmen with scant entries. Some were tales that drifted into print and hardened there. Together, they made the next stage easy. When the 20th century brought bigger ships, radios, and then airplanes, the habit of thinking of this region as a place where odd things happen was already formed. The stage was built. The audience was in their seats. The vanished vessels of the 19th century did not vanish into myth at once. They entered first into the paperwork of their owners, into the grief of their families, and into the quiet talk of sailors who understood the work. Only later did collectors of curious scenes pull them from their original context and hang them in a gallery with a suggestive name above the door. Knowing the original light and space helps us look at them honestly. If you want to watch a legend take root, follow the paper trail from ships that left port with tidy manifests and did not return. The most quoted case of the early 20th century begins not inside the triangle, but just above it, on the shoals that guard the North Carolina coast. In late January of 1921, the five-masted schooner Carroll A. Deering was sighted under full sail near Diamond Shoals, that long sandbar Cape Hatteras throws into the sea like a warning finger. She looked oddly kept for a ship in trouble. On January 31, a Coast Guard crew reached her at low tide and climbed aboard. The wheel was shattered. The binnacle box that shelters the compass was smashed and empty. There were plates on the galley stove and food laid out as if men had left in a hurry. The logbook, the sextant, the chronometer, and all the small boats were gone. No crew appeared. No message turned up in a bottle or on a beach. Washington convened a formal inquiry and listened to theories that ranged from mutiny to rum runners to the simple cruelty of a storm, then closed the file without a final answer. The Deering sat with her ribs in the sand for months and then was dynamited as a hazard to navigation. The ship's broken spine and the missing men were now a story anyone could shape to taste. 4 years later, a steamship named Cotopaxi cleared Charleston bound for Havana with a cargo of coal and a crew who could make the run with their eyes closed. On December 1 of 1925, she radioed that she was taking on water in heavy seas and that the pumps were failing. After that, nothing. The call placed her somewhere east of St. Augustine as a winter gale worked up the coast. Searches in the following days found no survivors. A ship that sinks in rough weather near the edge of the Gulf Stream leaves little behind, and the current does the rest. For decades, the Cotopaxi lived in a kind of footnote world. Anyone writing about unexplained losses in the region had room for a stout freighter that declared distress and then fell silent. In recent years, a wreck off the Florida coast was examined by divers and researchers who compared its features to the Cotopaxi's plans and fittings. Their conclusion was that the long unidentified hulk was in fact the missing ship, which would place the loss exactly where a careful reading of that last radio call suggested it would be. The appeal of a mystery gave way to a more ordinary truth. A weary hull in foul weather can fail quickly, and a winter sea does not hold wreckage politely for later inspection. The most sobering entry of all came in wartime, but far from battle. In March of 1918, the United States Navy collier USS Cyclops departed Barbados with manganese ore stacked in her deep holds and 306 people on board. She was a long steel ship of the Proteus class, built to haul coal and ore and to refuel other vessels. After clearing port, she sent a routine message that all was well. She never arrived in Baltimore. No distress call was logged. No wreckage washed ashore that could be tied to her. The Navy searched hard and then had to write that blunt phrase that families dread, lost with all hands. Rumors swirled because rumors always do. A German raider, a saboteur, a sudden structural failure. a squall line that came roaring in at night and rolled her before anyone could cut loose the oar. In the years that followed, investigators looked at the design of the class and noted that the long open holds and the steel framing could suffer if the ship was badly loaded or if the sea worked her at a certain rhythm. In other words, a possible weakness that a particular sea could find. Without the ship, there is no way to prove it, and so the Cyclops became a puzzle with only careful guesses for pieces. The puzzle deepened when two sisters to the Cyclops, the Proteus and the Nereus, vanished in late 1941 while carrying heavy cargoes of ore. Each left the Caribbean on a northern course. Each disappeared during winter weather, and each left no confirmed wreck to point at. Naval histories suggest that both may have broken up in storms under the strain of their loads. By then, the Atlantic was a war ocean with submarines everywhere, which gave some people a ready villain. German records after the war did not show claims for either ship. The absence of an enemy left the old suspects: a winter sea, a heavy load that could shift, a hull that could flex once too often. The mind reaches for a single cause that binds three losses because the symmetry is hard to ignore. The more modest reading is that similar ships, working similar routes in the same season, faced the same set of stresses, and that three of them met the same end beyond the range of rescue. There were other cases in those years that added texture to the ledger. In the 1920s, the steamer Vestris foundered off the Virginia Capes, a long way north, and left a messy record of poor loading and bad decisions. In the 1930s, a succession of small schooners and fruit boats came and went in rough weather without fuss. The point is not to dilute the famous stories. It is to show the mix. Ordinary losses set the baseline. The rare cases that leave no traces sit above the line and draw the eye. The triangle, as an idea, would later rely on that selective gaze. The ship that limped into port with a sprung plank does not enter legend. The one that did not limp in, and that left no plank to examine, does. Fate and paperwork sometimes met in strange ways. A ship might be listed as overdue for weeks, and then arrive with a sprung rudder and a crew who look permanently older. That entry disappears into the routine columns of the maritime press. Another ship might be reported lost by rumor and never corrected. A third could be listed with a date and a brief phrase and never investigated, either because war took precedence or because the owner had no means to mount a search. When later writers gathered the fragments, they did not always pull the matching corrections and the dull explanations. What remained made for a compelling cabinet of curiosities. The geography kept doing its quiet work beneath the drama. The Bahamas and the Straits of Florida are the sea's version of a city intersection. Ships that arc from the Gulf toward Europe must pass. Vessels from the canal headed for the eastern seaboard must pass. Little boats from Florida make short hops to Bimini and Grand Bahama, and sometimes press farther in weather they do not understand. A region with that much traffic will naturally account for a greater absolute number of mishaps than a quiet stretch of ocean that sees only a few trawlers and an occasional freighter. What turns those mishaps into mysteries is not the count, but the combination of deep water close to shore, fast currents, and quick weather. A hull that sinks in the Puerto Rico Trench is beyond easy recovery. A current that runs like a river can erase floating clues between sunrise and noon. Each of the marquee cases carried an afterlife. Relatives formed associations. Newspapers ran anniversary pieces. Divers made plans that outlived budgets. In the case of the Deering, every new gale that struck the banks raised hopes that some small iron stamped with a maker's mark would wash up and settle a debate. In the case of the Cyclops, every shadow on a sonar plot off the east coast invited a fresh flurry of letters. In the case of the Cotopaxi, Modern cameras and careful measurements gave a likely match and a measure of closure. Piece by piece, the mystery shelves lost a few exhibits, but not enough to thin the crowd. By the time the Second World War ended, people who watched the sea had already collected a series of unsolved losses that fit within the triangle drawn from Miami to Bermuda to Puerto Rico. That set of stories did not yet have a shared title. It did have staying power. When the first dramatic aviation cases arrived, they did not fall into empty space. They landed on a platform built of derelicts and vanishings, and official phrases like "cause unknown." The line from a smashed binnacle on a sandbar to a radio call that ends mid-sentence is straighter than it seems. The scene opens on a clear December afternoon in 1945 at Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale. The war has ended, the air is warm, and the routine of training flights has settled back over South Florida. 5 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers sit on the line, their engines coughing into life with that heavy radial thrum that shakes the ribs. Each carries fuel for several hours, a crew of 2 or 3, and the usual outfit of peacetime practice gear. The plan for the day is simple on paper. Fly east to the Bahama Shoals for target work, turn north to pick up a navigation leg, then swing back west to Florida. It was a standard exercise meant to sharpen basic skills for pilots who had spent the war flying over oceans. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, experienced and confident, with 4 student pilots in the other planes. In total, 14 men strapped in, checked their instruments, and lifted into the pale winter sky. The Avengers tracked east over the Straits of Florida toward shallow water marked on charts as practice grounds. In the clear air, the sea below changes from the deep blue of the Straits to the light turquoise of the Bahama banks. From a cockpit, this looks almost painted, a sign that the bottom rises toward you and that scattered coral heads sit up like knuckles. Here, crews dropped practice markers and flew tidy patterns, while instructors watched spacing, headings, and turns. Nothing about the first leg suggested trouble. Weather reports around midday noted fair conditions with a modest breeze and good visibility over most of the route. Seas were running, but not dangerous. This was not a day that sent anyone to the bulletin board to read warnings. Trouble first arrived as something very small. A voice over the radio said the leader's compass did not agree with what his eyes thought they were seeing. That happens now and then on long over-water flights. A compass can be affected by minor faults, a metal tool left near the panel, or just a quirk in the instrument. On land, you correct quickly. Over the ocean, you have fewer cues. The men finished their practice and turned for the second leg, but the leader began to doubt his position. Radio logs captured fragments that together make a simple human story. He believed they were south of where they should be. If that were true, the safe choice would be to head north and look for Florida. A controller on the ground thought they were east of the base and urged them to fly due west. A straight line would bring them back to the peninsula. The two views do not agree, and neither side has a clear picture. The next hour is a tangle of clipped phrases caught in static. The flight leader said more than once that both his compasses were not behaving. He said the water below did not look right. He thought he recognized the outline of islands, but could not make them fit his chart. Pilots in the other planes asked plain questions. Should we turn west? Do you have land in sight? One replied that his fuel was running lower than he liked. The sun moved down into the haze and took away the last of the useful shadows. A few squalls were reported by other aircraft in the region. Nothing like a major storm, but enough low cloud and rain to blur the horizon and make a pilot lean harder on the needle in front of him. Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and a network of other stations tried to help. Bearings can be taken if a transmitter speaks long enough and steady enough, and the towers asked the flight to send continuous signals. That proved hard to coordinate with the chatter and with the urge in every cockpit to keep talking. Controllers urged a simple westward course again. Send them west and they come home. In the lead aircraft, the belief that the group was over the Florida Keys and thus in danger of flying into the Gulf of Mexico if they turned west, held firm. That belief, if wrong, would nudge the formation farther out to sea. This is how small choices become large outcomes. On a chart, it looks obvious afterward. In a cockpit with fading light and confused radio, nothing feels obvious. The practical limits of the Avengers began to matter. Under normal conditions, the aircraft could stay aloft for about 5 hours on training power. That cushion shrinks as a formation wanders, and as pilots climb or descend in search of clear air. The ocean below in late afternoon can build a hard chop, and the thought of ditching a heavy aircraft in that water is never far from the mind. A pilot can set one down neatly if the surface is smooth, but a misjudged swell will catch a wing and turn the airplane in an instant. Crews trained for ditching and carried rafts and dive markers. They knew that any search at night would be difficult, even a few miles off a busy coast. Near sunset, the transmissions grew thinner. One last set of words suggested that the leader intended to keep the group together until fuel forced them down. Another voice urged a turn. The controllers heard enough to know the formation was in real danger, and they launched a rescue plan that was large by peacetime standards. A Martin Mariner flying boat left Banana River Naval Air Station with 13 crew, heavy with fuel and equipment. The kind of aircraft built to range far and find small specks in big water. A merchant ship to the east reported a fireball not long after the Mariner reached its patrol area. The report matched the known weakness of that aircraft, which could collect fuel vapors in the hull and ignite if a spark found them. The rescue plane never returned and never sent a clear distress call. The searchers became a second mystery over the same water. What followed was one of the largest air and sea searches the region had ever seen outside of wartime. Navy destroyers and cutters combed grids that covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. Aircraft flew low and slow in lines so tight the crews strained their eyes to keep spacing. Merchant ships out of curiosity and sympathy kept watch. Controllers revised search boxes every hour based on currents and wind. The Gulf Stream does not care about human schedules. It carried any floating object north and east and smeared the possible tracks into a fan. The rescue effort found no oil slick that could be tied to the Avengers. No empty raft, no cushion, no nameplate from a panel. The sea kept its secrets. When the Navy convened a board of investigation, the officers read the transcripts, interviewed controllers and pilots who had been on other flights, and drew up maps that now look heartbreakingly neat. They wrote what such boards often write when the record runs thin. Cause unknown. That was not a shrug. It was the only honest entry when the main witnesses are gone and the ocean offers no evidence. A few internal memoranda suggested that navigation errors probably compounded each other, that the leader was off the Florida coast to the east rather than over the Keys, and that the decision to avoid a westward turn sealed their fate as fuel dwindled. Another set of notes laid out the method by which a chain of radio bearings could have fixed things if signals had been longer. None of it changes the emptiness of the file. There is a tendency with famous incidents to load them with traits they did not have. Flight 19 did not take off into a violent storm. It did not fly into a known magnetic oddity that pulled needles around the circle like puppets on a string. The weather was fair for most of the route, with isolated showers that thickened as dusk approached. Compasses can drift or stick or simply be misread when stress rises. That is not science fiction. It is ordinary frailty in a device and in the humans who trust it. If the formation did push out over the open Atlantic, there was no land to catch the eye. only belts of light and dark water. A few degrees off for a few hours can turn a large map into empty sea. There is also a tendency to imagine that modern search tools were already in place in 1945. They were not. Shore stations could take bearings, but radar coverage was limited, and there were stretches of coast with no coverage at all. There were no satellite beacons in parachute packs. Radios were strong but subject to weather and to noise from other aircraft. Training groups often used procedures that worked well for routine flying and were less helpful when things began to unravel. In peacetime, the pressure to take a risky heading for a quick fix is less. Instructors tend to avoid gambles when students are aboard. All of those small truths lean toward the outcome that the board recorded. The human cost is the part that gives the case its lasting pull. 14 airmen in the Avengers and 13 in the flying boat went to work that morning and did not come home. Families received letters that could not explain much beyond the care that had been taken to find them. Fellow pilots kept the habits that the loss suggested. Check bearings in quiet voices. Keep someone close to a simple cardinal heading when doubt creeps in. Do not let a formation wander too long when fuel is tight. The case entered the oral tradition at Florida bases as a practical caution long before it entered the popular press as a mystery. Over time, Flight 19 became the centerpiece of a larger story about a region. It is easy to see why. The parts line up in a way a writer could not invent more neatly. Experienced leader, clear start, confusion on the radio, an entire formation missing, a rescue aircraft lost in the attempt, a search conducted at great scale with nothing to show for it. A simple triangle on a map gives that chain a frame. If one looks beyond the frame, the details point toward a place where navigation is often fine, until it is suddenly not fine, where squalls can smear horizons at just the wrong moment, and where currents erase clues with rude efficiency. None of this drains the curiosity from the case. It explains why it still draws attention. In an age that prides itself on locators and tracking and recovery, there is something unsettling about a set of airplanes that vanish with no wreckage found. Even now, privately funded expeditions lower side-scan sonars over likely bottoms and study returns that look promising. The seafloor is complicated here, cut by channels and banked by sand that moves. Targets that look good one season silt over by the next. Plausible fields are very wide, and the exact line flown in the final hour will probably never be known. What Flight 19 gave the public conversation was a focal point. It taught people to attach an idea to a patch of ocean. It gave the later 20th century a cautionary tale about overconfidence in instruments and about how easily groups repeat a leader's error when time is short. It also handed the legend makers a perfect chapter opening. When later authors grouped many different incidents under one title, this is the one they placed near the front, because it reads like a parable about the sea's indifference to clocks and intent. For our purposes, Flight 19 marks the start of the aviation era in the story of the Triangle. The ships that went missing earlier had created a background hum. The loss of 5 aircraft on a bright day raised the volume in a way everyone could hear. What came next would fix the shape of the legend for decades. When the last search plane returned to base without a sighting, the story of Flight 19 moved from the water to rooms with chalkboards and coffee urns. Officers pinned maps along the wall and drew lines that began neatly and then spread into fans across the western Atlantic. Every new line reflected a guess about wind, fuel, burn, and the pull of the Gulf Stream. It was diligent, and it was humbling. The sea had left nothing to guide a conclusion except broken radio exchanges and the knowledge that a group of sturdy aircraft did not have endless hours to roam. The Navy board listened to controllers who had tried to take bearings, to pilots who shared the same skies that afternoon, and to mechanics who knew how the Avengers behaved on long legs over water. They also studied the habits of rescue crews. The Martin Mariner that lifted off from Banana River did so heavy with fuel and gear. Men who flew that type were frank about its strengths and its quirks. The airplane could patrol for hours and haul a boat crew and supplies. It could also gather fuel vapors in its cavernous hull, and if a spark found them, the result was fast and final. A merchantman reported a brief flare on the horizon at about the right time. It was enough to turn one mystery into two, and to remind everyone that rescue work is its own risk. Out of those hearings came a handful of practical changes. Training officers began to preach a simple rule for crews who lost faith in their position east of Florida: turn west. It is an old truth dressed as a new policy. If you fly west long enough from almost anywhere over the Bahamas, you will meet land. Bases emphasized clearer radio discipline for emergencies. Send a steady carrier so shore stations can take a bearing. Keep chatter short. Synchronize watches before departure, and set checkpoints that reduce the chance of a small doubt growing into a group mistake. None of that is heroic. It is the slow, sensible work that follows a loss. The board did not name a villain. It wrote the phrase that still frustrates readers who want a single neat cause: unknown. In the files behind that word were notes that sketched possibilities. A leader convinced he was over the Keys rather than east of Florida. Compasses that disagreed by just enough to sow doubt. Squalls and haze that trimmed the horizon and turned the sea below into a vague patchwork. Student pilots who did what students often do in a tight spot. They tried to help by offering bearings and ideas, and the conversation became harder to manage as fuel ebbed. In the right light that reads like a parable about human limits rather than an omen about a triangle on a map. The press wrote the story briskly. There was surprise that such a loss could happen in peacetime. There was praise for the scale of the search. There was sympathy for the families. The wilder theories did not arrive at once. Those came later, when distance allowed memory to trade facts for mood. In the immediate aftermath, most people lean toward a sober view. The ocean is wide, radios are fallible, and an error of belief can move a group far from safety without any malice in the sky. Still, a few ideas began to circulate even then. People who worked with compasses pointed out the long wandering path of the agonic line, the place where a needle points to true north rather than magnetic north. When that line lay near Florida, an uncorrected course could drift. Navigators knew this. Students did not always apply it under stress. Others noted how easily the Gulf Stream could erase flotsam. A life raft on calm water will sit where you left it. A life raft in that current can be 10 miles away by the time a patrol gets to the origin point. To the public, the lack of debris felt uncanny. To search planners, it felt all too familiar. In the years that followed, the case grew a second life in print. Writers who loved a mystery copied fragments of radio transcripts that were never meant to be read as literature. A comment about a white haze became a signpost for strangeness. A remark about compasses refusing to settle became an indictment of the region rather than a note about one cockpit on one day. The rescue plane's loss became a narrative twist rather than a separate accident of a known risky type. A few authors claimed the weather had been perfectly serene when in fact pilots nearby noted showers and a sloppy chop by late afternoon. None of this was conspiracy. It was storytelling by people who preferred a shiver to an asterisk. A smaller group went the other way. They pulled maintenance logs and training schedules and compared them to the weather maps of the day. They noted that the Avengers on that flight did not carry long-range navigation aids that were just finding their way into cockpits. They pointed to earlier mishaps in which pilots misidentified Bahama Cays for Florida islands at low altitude. They interviewed surviving controllers who described how difficult it was to keep a steady bearing on a weak and intermittent signal when other traffic filled the band. Their picture was less glamorous and more persuasive. The pieces that troubled people were ordinary when seen up close. The hard part was that the pieces did not add up to a wreck you could visit. Every few years, someone reports a find that might end the guessing. More than one Avenger has been located in the waters off South Florida. Some crashed on training flights unrelated to the December loss. Such discoveries brought headlines and then sober corrections. The exact path of Flight 19 inches its last hour remains the unsolved variable in every search plan. If the group held together and flew a consistent heading, the search area is one kind of wide. If they scattered in low fuel, it is another kind. The bottom here is not a tidy shelf. Channels cut through banks. Sand shifts across wrecks. A target that looks promising on a sonar screen one season can be buried the next. Out on the waterfront, the case took on a practical use. Instructors told their students the story on rainy mornings and drew 2 arrows on the chalkboard. 1 arrow east and a question mark. 1 arrow west and a little palm tree. It was a gentle way to say that pride in a fix should not keep you from a simple decision when the day starts to close in. Rescue crews adopted the habit of preparing drift models before wheels left the ground, so they could draw a better box without delay if a flight went quiet. Controllers rehearsed how to assign one voice to take charge on a busy frequency. These are quiet legacies of a famous loss. As decades passed, Flight 19 became the keystone people reached for when they wanted to argue that the region had a personality. It supplied a set of elements in a line that is hard to resist. Military aircraft. Clear start. Confusing middle. No end in sight. A rescue that adds to the toll. A search that finds nothing. When later cases appear on the page beside it, the whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. For many readers, that is enough to promote geography into character. For others, it is an invitation to look closely at how ordinary events can look extraordinary when evidence is missing. The balance between those two views is the heart of the fallout. Families were left with memory and no grave. The Navy improved procedures. Writers found a story that sold. Pilots and sailors learned a caution that felt timeless. The public learned a name for a patch of sea that would soon collect more incidents. The next set of losses would involve passenger airliners, and the effect on the legend would be immediate and lasting. The winter after the war brought a new kind of traffic to the open Atlantic. Military crews had gone home, airfields had shifted to peacetime, and civilian routes stitched together islands and continents with a confidence that belonged to a new age. Airliners did not yet have the layered safeguards we take for granted today. Navigation meant radio bearings, dead reckoning, and a pilot's practiced sense for wind and drift. Weather forecasts were good, but not perfect. Long overwater legs still asked for judgment. In that setting, 2 British South American Airways Tudor airliners and a Douglas transport on a Caribbean night wrote 3 stark entries into the record. The first of the British losses was Star Tiger. She was an Avro Tudor on a westbound service in late January of 1948, making a hop from the Azores to Bermuda. That leg looks simple on a wall map and feels anything but simple in a cockpit. A strong headwind over the North Atlantic in winter can turn a tidy flight plan into a slog. The crew chose to fly low, near 2,000 feet, to sit beneath the worst of the wind. That choice made sense for fuel, but carried its own risks. At that height, you are close to the top of the sea. Turbulence can be sharp. A small navigational error at night gives you little time to correct. Spray and rain squalls are hard to see until they are on you. Star Tiger reported position checks along the track, passed through the usual radio handovers, and sounded calm. Near dawn, she was expected over Bermuda. She never arrived. What is known comes from the timings of those routine calls and from the weather maps for that night. Wind was stronger than forecast. There were patches of low cloud. Fuel was sufficient but not generous after a long push. The airframe had no known fault. Bermuda's radio operators were waiting for a descent call that did not come. When the hours slid by, the island mounted a search that reached out in widening arcs from the expected approach path. Ships took up lines along probable currents. Aircraft flew grids that no crew forgets. Nothing appeared. The Civil Air Ministry later reviewed the crew's choices and the state of the Tudor and wrote a conclusion that was careful and unsatisfying. No wreckage, no bodies, no proof of a structural failure. The most likely cause, they said, was a combination of weather and navigation at low altitude that brought the aircraft down at sea before anyone could transmit a distress call. A year later, almost to the month, another Tudor vanished. Star Ariel departed Bermuda on a clear January morning in 1949, bound for Kingston in Jamaica. The weather was described as excellent. The sea below was placid in that winter blue way that looks friendly from the ground and very thin from the sky. The captain was experienced, and so were his radios. Shortly after takeoff, he sent routine position information and a request to shift frequency to improve reception. After that, there was silence. There were reports of a faint carrier wave without voice. Nothing more. Once again, searches fanned out from a line on a chart. Once again, the ocean offered no clue. The bare facts encourage larger questions. Why two airliners from the same company, in the same region within a year? Why one at night in mixed weather and one in daylight, with a forecast that read like an invitation? Investigators looked at the Tudor type and at the way the airline planned its routes. The Tudor was a pressurized four-engined aircraft adapted from wartime technology. Its reputation was mixed rather than poor. There were known issues with icing and with systems that were improving with each refit, but nothing that pointed to a sudden disintegration in clear air. The airline, eager in a new market, ran long oceanic legs with the radio equipment and dispatch habits of the day. That meant crews sometimes shifted frequencies without the firm relay networks that later became standard. A smooth handover is essential when a problem blooms quickly. If you change channels at the wrong moment, you can spend a few long minutes calling into the quiet while the station you left keeps listening where you no longer are. The human dimension of Star Ariel is the part that lingers. It was a clear morning. The islands drop away, and the long road of blue begins. A confident crew handles routine housework. Passengers settle with books and conversations. Somewhere south of Bermuda, the line breaks. There is no storm to blame. There is no last call to work with. Theories stack up because silence invites them. A spark in a cargo hold. A structural failure that began as a crack and raced through a wing. A sudden loss of pressurization that turned into a rapid descent. Each is plausible in the abstract and impossible to prove without a single piece of wreckage. Between those two British losses sits a third case that has fed the idea of a region where aircraft simply vanish. In late December of 1948, a Douglas DC-3 on a commercial run departed San Juan for Miami on a Caribbean night. The DC-3 is a stout airframe that built a legend for reliability. Crews trusted it because it forgave much. On this night, the picture was complicated. The aircraft had shown electrical and radio troubles in the days before departure. There were notes about batteries and generators that suggested charging was not what it should be. Some equipment had been removed and serviced. The captain was aware of these details and was not a man to panic. He reported in to controllers along the way, asked for homing assistance as he approached the Florida coast, and then radioed that he was near 50 miles from Miami. After that, there was only static. The weather that night was not severe. There were scattered showers and a firm breeze. Witness statements later collected by investigators suggested that the aircraft may have been flying a little lower than the filed plan, perhaps to sit under a deck of cloud or to find smoother air. If your navigation receiver is unreliable, you do what you can with what you have. Pilots of that era were taught to work a triangle of time, speed, and heading. When winds are stronger than expected, and when the Gulf Stream adds its own set, the triangle can fall apart quickly. The last known position call placed the DC-3 within easy reach of the lights of Miami. If it was not exactly where the captain thought, fuel margins could have narrowed to nothing while crews on the ground peered out over a sea that gave no sign. It is tempting to link these three incidents by a single thread and give it a label. The more useful thing is to set them in their context. Transoceanic air traffic in the late 1940s was safe by the standards of the time, and not yet safe by the standards of our own. Overwater navigation remained vulnerable to small errors that grew. Radio communication could become patchy at the edges of coverage. Homing beacons relied on steady signals and on equipment in good order. Weather forecasts were based on sparse upper air observations. Crews often flew altitudes that fit their fuel plan more than their radar picture, because radar coverage was still a coastal thing. Descent, planning into Bermuda and into Miami, involved long stretches over water and an expectation that everything would remain normal. When it did not, a minute or two could decide what was possible. Search work in those years was both disciplined and limited. Bermuda's flying boats could range far, but their crewmen were looking from human eyes at a sea that reflects the sun by day and eats light by night. Oil slicks fade. A white raft against a white cap is from the air a hard ask. The ocean between the Bahamas and Bermuda sits beside some of the deepest water in the Atlantic. The Puerto Rico Trench lies to the south. The Blake Basin lies off the Florida shelf. A heavy object that reaches those depths does not offer many second chances. Without floating debris, a line of bearing and a last time stamp cannot give you a recovery without the grace of chance. As the public tried to make sense of these losses, writers gathered details into stories that felt like elegies and like puzzles. They noted the odd pairing of a night loss and a day loss. They made much of the missing radio calls for Star Aerial. They pointed out that the DC-3 pilot had reported being near the coast and then was not. They sometimes left out the part about known electrical problems and marginal batteries, because that dented the mystery. They sometimes polished the weather reports into perfection when nearby logs spoke of showers and thin cloud. The result was a picture that felt more uncanny than the original file's support. The official reports are cooler in tone. For Star Tiger, the hypothesis is that the aircraft was flown at low level in conditions that made accurate navigation difficult and that fuel and fatigue closed the margin for error. For Star Aerial, the best that could be offered was a suggestion that a sudden failure, perhaps in communications and perhaps in a vital system, left the crew with no time to speak before the aircraft reached the water. For the DC-3, the report underlines known electrical issues, questions about the state of the batteries, and the possibility that wind pushed the aircraft off track while fuel calculations did not keep pace. What these events did do, as a set, was change habits. Airlines tightened radio procedures on frequency changes over water. Bermuda improved relay practices with aircraft passing out of one range into the next. Maintenance standards rose as companies learned that a small, nagging flaw on land can become a critical failure over open sea. Navigation aids, were upgraded and multiplied. Flight dispatchers began to track long overwater legs with a more active hand rather than waiting for a top-of-descent call. For the legend of the region, the effect was immediate. Here were not military training flights but paying passengers in peacetime. Here were crews with uniforms and names in the newspaper, and families in England and the Caribbean waiting on telegrams. The phrase "vanished without trace" appeared more than once in the span of a year. It is a phrase that does not sit quietly in the mind. It invites a picture in which the sea itself has an appetite. Reasonable explanations exist for each of these losses, yet the lack of physical proof allowed a larger tale to form around them. In living rooms, people drew a triangle on maps and nodded to themselves as if a geometry problem had been revealed. From the standpoint of a history told plainly, the lesson is kinder and more useful. The late 40s were a hinge between heroic early aviation and the layered systems of modern flight. The Tudor crews and the DC-3 crew flew into that hinge with courage and skill, and when their luck ran out, the ocean left few clues. Their stories remind us that navigation is a craft, that radios matter more than any new paint on a fuselage, and that 100 miles of blue can be either a corridor or a void, depending on the day. The years after the war filled the sky over the Bahamas and Florida Straits with every kind of aircraft. Naval patrol planes worked long arcs, military transports shuttled men and cargo, and a growing mix of private and charter pilots stitched together island hops with the confidence that follows a good weather report. Not every incident became famous. Many were the kind of losses that make local news and then pass into logbooks. Yet together, they show how easily a routine flight in this region can turn on small things. Take the big military transports that crossed these waters in the late 1940s. In 1947, a 4-engined C-54 was flying from Bermuda toward the mainland when it entered heavy turbulence. The crew reported control trouble, descended, and then went into the sea. Wreckage was recovered, which is why the case does not haunt popular books. It sits in official files as a grim reminder that strong winter air over warm current can tear at an aircraft in ways that training prepares you for and still sometimes defeats. The important point is that not every loss or near loss here is mysterious. Some are sadly straightforward. A gust that loads a wing at just the wrong instant. A descent begun a minute too late. There is a different kind of lesson in the disappearance of a C-119 flying boxcar in 1965. The twin-boom transport left Florida on a long overwater leg toward Grand Turk in good order. Radio contact placed it north of the Crooked and Acklins chain in the Bahamas, then silence. Days later, bits of cargo pallet and a few marked pieces that fit the type washed up on Bahamian beaches. No survivors were found. The weather that day included scattered storms. With 2 large radial engines and a high-drag airframe, the flying boxcar demanded care in turbulence and in heavy rain. Investigators could not point to a single cause, but the pattern of debris suggested a violent in-flight breakup or a very hard impact. Again, nothing supernatural is needed to understand how that outcome can follow from bad cells and poor luck. Smaller aircraft have their own catalogue of hazards in these latitudes. Many private flights in the 50s and 60s used non-directional beacons and low-frequency radio ranges. At night, those signals can fade and skip. A pilot could listen to a steady tone, believe he was on course, and not realize that a skywave had shifted the apparent bearing. Lauren signals served parts of the coast, but coverage across the islands was patchy. VOR stations had not yet grown thick on the ground away from the mainland. In clear daylight, a chain of Bahama Cays is a friendly set of stepping stones. At night, or in a rain shawl that hides the horizon, they become a chain of dark shapes, with few lights and few alternates. There is the matter of illusions. Pilots call it the black hole effect. On a calm night over water, with no ground lights ahead and cloud above, depth perception shrinks. The world becomes a tunnel with no texture. Without a disciplined scan of the instruments, a descent can creep in. The Gulf Stream does not care about any of this. It moves fast, and it moves on a line that crosses many approach paths. If a pilot misjudges height and ditches cleanly, the aircraft can break apart without leaving much on the surface for long. Even a cushion or a map case becomes a poor clue when the current carries it away at several knots. Radio habits of the time could make a bad situation worse. Crews often changed frequency as they left one control area and entered another. If that change happened just as a problem arrived, they could find themselves calling on one channel while the station listening for them was on the old one. A few minutes of crossed wires in an emergency can be the difference between a homing bearing and a missed chance. The Star Aerial case from the previous chapter illustrated this in the starkest way. Even when crews did everything right, the mesh of the system had larger holes than we accept today. Search and rescue work in this region had to grow up quickly to match that reality. The Coast Guard and Navy used patterns that sound tidy on paper and are hard work in the air. Creeping line, expanding square, sector search. All begin with a datum, the best guess at last position, and then add wind, surface drift, and likely leeway of any raft. In the triangle, those calculations have to include the Gulf Stream and the lesser coastal currents that fold around the banks. A datum can slide miles while aircraft warm up on the ramp. A neat box on a chalkboard becomes a long rectangle that marches north as the day passes. Crews who flew these patterns learned the local sea by sight. They could tell from the texture of the surface when a squall line had brushed it an hour earlier. They could smell fuel in the air and turn into wind on a hunch, only to find a fisherman waving from a small craft that had nothing to do with their task. The mid-century also brought a string of forced landings and rescues that never made it into the legend because they ended well. A charter pilot with tourists on board loses his ADF to a thunderstorm and follows the color of water to the tongue of the ocean, then catches a weak bearing from Nassau and arrives with minutes of fuel. A Navy patrol crew picks up ice over the Sargasso in an odd winter layer, descends, and watches the needles dance as static crackles across the canopy, then flies through to clearer air, with nothing worse than some embarrassed laughter over the interphone. A freighter out of San Juan loses an engine at dusk and sets down near a cutter that had been practicing that afternoon. Nobody writes books about these days, but the same currents, the same cloud lines, and the same magnetic quirks were present. Instrument behavior gave many of the close calls their flavor. Compass variation in this region is not a secret, but the line of zero variation has wandered across the western Atlantic at different times. When a pilot fails to adjust heading for declination, the error grows with distance. Automatic direction finders can point faithfully to lightning at night if a pilot is not skeptical. Radio ranges can fade near sunrise and sunset. A pilot who knows these tricks from experience shrugs and sets a fresh mental cross-check. A new pilot flying his first Bahama leg in summer may chase a needle and wander 20 miles off a planned track without realizing it until the shoreline does not match the chart. Weather added its own drama without asking anyone's permission. In summer, the trade wind makes earnest cumulus towers by noon. Over the banks, they can grow into lines that drop curtains of rain and send gusts out in all directions. Over the deep water beyond the shelf, the same cell can be all glare and no reference. A small twin that tries to top a tower finds it taller than expected and ends up in heavy rain, with the climb rate bleeding away. Icing is rare here at low levels, but in winter, an air mass that has spent time over the continent can lay a thin sheet of rime on an airframe at 10,000 feet. Pilots learn to smell that kind of day in the morning. Newcomers assume island air is always benign, and sometimes discover the exception the hard way. A number of cases from the 50s and 60s show how mixed causes can look like a single mystery when written as a list. A Navy trainer disappears near Andros on a night gunnery hop. Later investigation finds that the aircraft likely flew into the sea in a shallow descent after workload overwhelmed the student. A private twin vanishes between Bimini and Miami after a late departure, and a weather line builds faster than forecast. Debris washes ashore after a day, and the story ends there. A charter goes missing between San Juan and St. Croix, and is found by fishermen the next morning, with the cabin filled and the crew alive on the wing. The headline goes to the missing ones. The lessons sit quiet in accident briefs and in the practice rooms where new pilots hear them. None of this suggests that people imagine the struggles. It says the stage here is busy, the cues are subtle, and the consequences of a small mistake can be swift. When popular writers later gathered a roster of events to argue for a special character to the sea between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, they were drawing from a large pool in which everyday causes and rare outcomes both swam. The cases that left no trace naturally rose to the top. The ones that left parts and reasons slipped to the bottom. From a distance, it is easy to see only the cream. By the early 1960s, the Triangle's reputation had a proper stage and a paying audience. Ships still steamed through in great numbers, and aircraft still wrote straight lines across the sky. But now every odd case earned a little more attention than it would have a generation earlier. Two stories from that decade still sit near the front of any list. One is the loss of a large tanker that set off from the Gulf Coast full of molten sulfur and never reached Virginia. The other is the strange vanishing of a small pleasure boat only a mile off Miami with the lights of the city in plain view. The tanker was the Marine Sulphur Queen. She began life as a T-2 hull, a common workhorse of the war years, and was later converted into a carrier for hot liquid sulfur. The conversion required long heated tanks, heavy insulation, and piping that kept the cargo near the temperature of a bread oven. She departed Beaumont, Texas, in early February 1963, loaded deep, and pointed her bow through the Gulf toward the Straits of Florida. A routine radio message near the lower Florida Keys placed her on course and on schedule. After that, there was silence. She did not arrive at Norfolk. The Coast Guard launched a search that reached from the Keys up past Cape Canaveral, and within days found scattered objects that could be tied to the ship. Life jackets, a name board, bits of raft and cork. No hull, no people. The investigation that followed was sober and thorough. Inspectors studied the conversion design and the maintenance records. They interviewed crew from sister ships and surveyors who had walked the keel and frames in dry dock. The picture that emerged was not of a haunted sea, but of a vessel under high loads, with a history of structural strain. The T-2 hull had known issues with cracking in cold water when stressed. The conversion to carry hot sulfur placed new demands on a steel frame built for other work. Reports mentioned weeping seams, corrosion in way of the tanks, and the kind of repeated heating and cooling that can fatigue metal over years. There was talk of gas pockets and of fumes, though nothing firm tied that idea to the loss. In the end, the Coast Guard wrote that the vessel was probably not fit for the service in which she was employed, and that a structural failure at sea could explain the sudden end without leaving a large raft of debris in a fast current. It was not a satisfying conclusion for newspapers. It was persuasive to people who know how ships age. The second case is the one many Floridians still tell visiting friends. On the evening of the 22nd of December 1967, a small cabin cruiser named Witchcraft left a Miami marina for a short outing to look at the Christmas lights along the shore. 2 men were aboard. The night was calm. Somewhere near the sea buoy off Government Cut, barely a mile from the beach, the skipper radioed the Coast Guard to say the boat may have struck something and to request a tow. He was not in danger. He would keep his anchor light on. A cutter made for the position, a run so short that you can trace it with one finger on a chart. 19 minutes later, the crew arrived and found open water. No hull, no crew, no flares. Over the next days, aircraft and boats searched hundreds of square miles of ocean. Nothing turned up. The strangeness of that gap is what keeps the story alive. 1 mile is within sight of hotel balconies and beach chairs. The Coast Guard's response was quick. The weather was forgiving. Yet in the time it takes to make a pot of coffee, the scene had erased itself. Investigators did what they could with what little they had. They looked at the design of the boat and at the state of the currents. They learned that even on a placid night, the Florida current can pull at an anchor line as if a hand were tugging it. They knew that a small cruiser can ship water over the stern in the wake of a passing freighter, and that a sudden list can throw 2 men to one side and give the next wave its chance. They made no firm finding because there was nothing firm to anchor it to. The file closed with the familiar economy of words. Missing, presumed lost. The decade had other entries that built a mood. A freighter with a general cargo vanishes south of the Bahamas and is later found to have had a history of corrosion and a tired crew. A small charter aircraft bound for Nassau fails to report a position and is found on a reef with everyone safe, a tidy rescue that never makes a book. A Navy patrol plane takes a beating in a squall line and limps to base with torn skin and a calm note from the crew chief about repairs. Each event is ordinary in isolation. Read together on the same page, they begin to sound like a chorus. As the calendar turned, the stories kept coming. In the spring of 1973, a freighter carrying cement left Fort Lauderdale for Puerto Rico and went quiet near the old Bahama Channel. Searchers found a life ring days later and nothing more. There were strong squalls in the area that week. Cement can set fast when water finds it, turning a long cargo hold into a single heavy stone. The physics of that are plain if harsh. The file sits in the same drawer as the Marine Sulphur Queen. Heavy cargo, structural load, sudden failure without a showy memorial on the surface. The pattern repeated into the present century, though modern cases tend to be smaller and lonelier. In July 2015, 2 14-year-old boys put out from Jupiter Inlet in a 19-foot boat on a summer day that began well and turned unkind. When they did not return, the Coast Guard searched a wide swath of ocean for a week. Their skiff was found many months later, 1,000 miles from Florida, near Bermuda. It was empty. The Gulf Stream and the prevailing wind had done exactly what the textbooks say they do. They had carried a light object along the arc of the subtropical gyre and set it down near the door of the Sargasso Sea. The loss had nothing to do with legends. It had everything to do with youth, weather, and a river in the ocean that does not tire. In late 2020, a small, open boat that left Bimini for Florida with 20 people aboard failed to arrive. The distance looks like nothing on a map. It is a hard run for a low freeboard craft when wind comes up against the current. Search aircraft and cutters covered a region larger than some states, recalculating drift every few hours, and found no trace. The sea keeps such secrets easily in winter. A sharp squall, a shift of weight, a rail under for one moment, and then the water is in charge. To families ashore, the absence of debris feels eerie. To people who work those waters, the absence feels tragically normal. There are quieter cases that receive attention mainly because of where they occur. In 2017, a business jet left Puerto Rico for Florida and vanished from radar east of Eleuthera. Debris and remains were located by the next day. Weather was fair. The aircraft was a high-performance type with a demanding reputation. The investigation pointed to an in-flight failure that had nothing to do with currents or compass. The triangle is so famous by now that any event inside its loose borders earns a headline. Many of those events end with causes that fit the broader record of aviation: mechanical weakness, pilot error, a lapse that would have been survivable near a runway but proved unforgiving over open water. Set these stories against the geography we have already mapped, and a few themes stand out. The Florida current can move flotsam many miles in a single tide, which turns a neat search box into a long ribbon. The shelf falls away quickly to deep basins where heavy objects do not announce themselves. Weather in the trades can look polite and then raise sharp little squalls faster than a forecast model can update. Small boats that are comfortable inside Biscayne Bay are not the same craft you want in the open straits with wind against current. Ships that carry dense cargo ask their crews to be perfect at loading and at ballast, and the sea does not always let them be. What makes the Marine Sulphur Queen and the Witchcraft endure is not that they cannot be explained. It is that the explanations require us to accept how easily seawater can end a story without leaving anything for later visitors to point at. We like puzzles that surrender a lock of hair or a glove. This region often offers nothing. When an inquiry has to end with careful possibilities rather than a firm cause, a space opens that folklore is eager to fill. Into that space pour talk of strange fogs and compasses that spin and lights that hang over the waves. The documents in the archives say something less theatrical. They say that heavy ships can break, that small boats can abruptly go wrong, and that even a quick response from shore can arrive to find a clean horizon. By the time the triangle earned a reputation, a quieter question had begun to circle in offices where people keep statistics. Is this region actually more dangerous than other busy corners of the ocean? The agencies that track accidents said no. The Coast Guard pointed out that the area between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico carries heavy traffic by sea and by air, and that the absolute number of incidents rises where the number of journeys rises. Lloyd's and other underwriters did not charge special rates for the region. NOAA spokespeople answered letters with the same calm line. There is no evidence of an unusual cluster once you adjust for exposure. That view may not make headlines, but it is the baseline from which every good explanation starts. Exposure is not the only part of the puzzle. Reporting habits help build myths. In earlier centuries, a ship that vanished left a single line in a ledger. In the 20th century, a ship that vanished left a file folder and sometimes a headline. Starting in the 1960s, anything that happened inside the loose triangle boundaries earned a larger audience. A freighter lost in the Indian Ocean was a tragedy. A freighter lost north of the Bahamas became a talking point. That is not a property of the sea, it is a property of attention. Geography plays its quiet part. Look at a bathymetric chart, and the whole story sharpens. The Florida shelf ends in a clean cliff. Beyond that escarpment, the bottom falls into the Blake Basin. To the south, the Puerto Rico Trench drops farther than 5 miles in places. The Bahamas are ringed by shallow carbonate banks that end suddenly at the tongue of the ocean and other deep cuts. A small aircraft that reaches deep water will not be found without a directed search and a measure of luck. A cargo ship that breaks up where the current runs strong will leave a thin trail. None of this is mysterious. It is the sober physics of a steep underwater landscape. Currents shape the outcome above that landscape. The Gulf Stream is a real mover. It is as fast as a river, and it runs day and night. On its western edge near Florida, it can carry floating debris far from an incident site before a patrol aircraft even launches. On the banks and channels of the Bahamas, smaller streams fold in and out of the main flow like feeder roads. A search box that was tight at noon can be a long ribbon by sunset. When a report says no debris was found, that does not prove that debris never existed. It often means it was carried out of reach before the first grid line was flown. Weather supplies the rest of the context. The region sits under the path of hurricanes for half the year. In winter, cold fronts push out over warm water and can trigger sharp squalls. In summer, convection builds into tall towers by early afternoon. Water spouts are not rare. Microbursts and gust fronts can complicate the last miles of a visual approach to an island field. None of this is exotic. It is simply active weather at a meeting place of air masses. Place long overwater legs and heavily used shipping lanes under that sky, and you have the ingredients for both incidents and empty search results. There is a smaller, more stubborn topic that deserves a clear paragraph. Compasses. The Western Atlantic has a long history of sailors talking about needles that drift. The truth is not mysterious. Compasses point to magnetic north rather than true north. And the difference between the two is called declination. The line of zero declination, called the agonic line, has wandered over the centuries and at times has passed near Florida. Navigators have long known to correct for it. In the days before electronic aids, a tired crew that failed to apply the correction could hold a heading that looked right and arrive somewhere quite wrong. That is not a glitch in the planet. It is a workaday problem multiplied by distance and by weather that hides the Sunday. The folklore way of saying this is that compasses go mad in the triangle. The practical way is that people sometimes forgot to apply a known adjustment under stress. Other scientific ideas have been floated with more novelty than evidence. Methane hydrates buried under the seabed can, in theory, release gas in large bubbles that lower water density and cause a hull to founder. The phenomenon is real in places where hydrates sit close to the surface. There has been no clear link between a specific triangle loss and a measured gas blowout. It remains a thought worth filing under rare and not a general explanation. Rogue waves are different. They are now well documented. These are steep and powerful waves that can exceed surrounding seas by a startling amount and that have damaged ships in many oceans. The interaction of strong currents with opposing winds is one of several ways such waves can form. The western edge of the Gulf Stream gives you that setting often enough to take the idea seriously. A large slab-sided vessel that meets one at the wrong angle can take a hit that no stability table likes. Human factors run through the record as a constant thread. Cargoes that can shift or liquefy need careful loading and ballast. The ore carriers that went missing in the early 40s were working near their limits in winter seas. The Marine Sulphur Queen carried a heavy hot cargo in a converted hull with known fatigue issues. Small boats press out of Bimini or Miami with fuel enough for the trip in fair weather and then try to race a line of squalls back to the coast. Private pilots in the 50s and 60s flew by non-directional beacons that fade at night, and by dead reckoning that asks for more judgment than most people use on their first crossing. A story that begins with a romantic question mark often ends with one of these plain truths. Technology has changed the balance. The late 1970s brought emergency beacons that talk to satellites. GPS took the mystery out of the question, where am I? Weather satellites made a map of cloud cover that a dispatcher can read in real time. In the cockpit, recorders and better training turned instinct into procedure. At sea, radar and AIS allow ships to see each other and to be seen. Side-scan sonar and autonomous vehicles have turned large areas of seafloor from blank to known. The triangle did not calm down. We just became better at finding our way and at finding answers after the fact. The number of unsolved cases shrank as the tools improved. A good many famous tales thin out when you check the first reports. Some well-known vanishings occurred outside the triangle's boundaries, as they are most often drawn. Some cases that are said to have left no wreckage did, in fact, produce debris that was logged and then forgotten by later writers. Stories set in perfect weather turn out to have happened in the sloppy wraparound of a passing front. The Ellen Austen episode that people love for its eerie symmetry has scant support in contemporary shipping intelligence and looks more like a sailor's tale that hardened into print. This is how folklore behaves. It grows where records are spotty and where storytellers prefer clean lines to messy footnotes. There is also a bias in how we remember. Events that leave survivors carry their own corrections. Pilots and sailors explain what happened. Investigators publish careful reports. Those episodes drop off the mystery list. The ones that leave no voices remain open to interpretation. With time, dates and distances can be smoothed and draped over a map with a neat triangle outlined in pencil. The human mind prefers patterns to noise. Once the triangle idea took hold, it became a frame into which many unrelated events could be placed. None of this is meant to strip away the dignity of the losses. A radio that grows faint and a horizon that goes grey will unsettle any crew. The cases that stump us do so because evidence is thin, not because the sea holds a special curse. If you read the files that sit behind the headlines, you get a consistent lesson. The region is busy. The weather is lively. The bottom is deep. The current is strong. The tools were once imperfect. People sometimes made mistakes. When all of those truths line up in the wrong hour, you can get an empty file and a headline that says vanished without a trace. If you stand back, the most interesting part of the triangle story is not the sea. It is us. We built a name that tied together a set of places that share currents and weather and traffic. We chose a few striking cases and let them stand for the whole. We kept the ones with the least evidence and let go of the ones with clear causes, because one group feeds wonder and the other teaches homework. Even so, the careful work did not stop. Surveyors identified long suspected wrecks. Accident boards improved training. The Coast Guard kept rewriting search plans to match what the sea actually does. In quiet ways, the mystery has been shrinking for decades. Before a place can become a legend, it needs a label you can say over coffee. For years, the disappearances in the Western Atlantic were just that, scattered cases with dates and coordinates. In the early 1950s, a few writers began to pull the threads together and give the public a sense that these events shared an address. The name that stuck arrived a little later, but the stage was set by clattering newsrooms, pulp magazines on drugstore racks, and a readership newly hooked on mysteries that lay just off the coast. In September 1950, a Miami reporter named Jones wrote a short wire story that did a simple and potent thing. He listed a handful of ships and planes that had gone missing near Florida and the Bahamas and asked if there was a pattern. He mentioned the vanished Navy bombers from 1945, the big Collier from 1918, and recent civilian losses that had left families staring at a bare horizon. There was no fever in his tone. He sounded like a man who had noticed that several unanswered questions seemed to live in the same neighborhood. The piece ran in South Florida papers and was picked up elsewhere in condensed form. It did not christen anything. It did suggest that the sea off the peninsula had earned a file folder of its own. 2 years later, a magazine called Fate took a stronger line. Fate was a digest for readers who liked flying saucers, haunted houses, and things that went bump in the night. In 1952, it ran an article by a writer using the name George X. Sand that sketched a loose triangle with Miami at one corner, Bermuda at another, and Puerto Rico at the third. Within those lines, he placed several disappearances and allowed himself to wonder out loud if ordinary explanations were enough. The tone was speculative, which fit the magazine, and the effect was memorable. Here was a clean shape on a map that gathered a messy set of stories and made them feel like a single mystery. The article reached a broad audience for the first time outside the trade press and gave readers an image they could carry around in their heads. The early 60s added fuel from a different direction. In December 1962, the American Legion magazine published a dramatic feature on the loss of Flight 19. The writer took the dry text of radio logs and turned it into a narrative of men battling confusion over an empty sea. He used dialogue in a way that made controllers sound like characters in a play. Veterans read it with a mix of pride and unease. It was not a technical paper. It was a story. For many civilians, it was the first time the vanished Avengers felt like people you could picture, and it pulled the whole subject closer to the living room. The label that everybody remembers arrived in February 1964 inches the pages of Argosy. Argosy was a pulp magazine that loved adventure and the unexplained. Vincent Gaddis wrote an article called The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, and with that headline he named the thing. He did more than coin a phrase. He gathered cases from naval files and old newspapers, drew the now familiar three-point shape from Florida to Bermuda to Puerto Rico, and said plainly that something odd lived there. He had a knack for tone. He marshaled facts with a storyteller's rhythm. He made a map feel sinister without shouting. The piece landed at a moment when the country was curious about space, worried about the Cold War, and newly open to the thought that the world still held pockets of the unknown. The phrase Bermuda Triangle stuck the way a good brand name sticks. It sounded nautical and precise, and faintly ominous. Gaddis followed with a book a year later that placed the triangle in a larger cabinet of maritime oddities. He was not the first to collect such cases. Charles Fort had been doing that with storms of frogs and mysterious fires long before. And Rupert Gould had written in the interwar years about strange events at sea. But Gaddis gave this corner of the Atlantic a tidy frame and a voice that felt modern. He cited the Cyclops and Flight 19. He pointed to passenger aircraft that had gone missing without a flare. He sketched charts with straight edges and invited readers to imagine vessels reaching those edges and failing to cross. By the end of the decade, other writers took up the file. John Wallace Spencer brought out a book that devoted itself entirely to the subject and made the triangle a star rather than a chapter. He placed a map near the front that showed the 3 points, listed the best-known cases, and hinted that the list might be much longer if only someone did the work. Newspaper editors in coastal cities obliged by running features with headlines that paired the name with words like mystery and curse. Airline passengers read them in gate lounges and looked out at the sea with a new sort of attention. It helped that the larger culture was primed. The late 50s and early 60s were the age of saucers and lights in the sky. Reports of unidentified craft over the desert and over farm fields were in the papers. The first astronauts were flying, and people spoke freely about the unknown. Ignatius, Donnelly's old musings about Atlantis wandered back through used bookshops. A public that had grown up with war news now browsed for wonder. A triangle of water where solid vessels and modern aircraft had disappeared without nice clean answers met that appetite. You could imagine causes that were exotic, or you could imagine the sea being simply merciless. Either way, the stories were hard to put down. There were also sober voices, but they traveled more slowly. The Coast Guard in Miami kept a form letter for curious readers that explained currents and storms and statistics. Lloyd's in London pointed out that insurance rates for ships did not change on one side of an imaginary line. A handful of magazine writers pushed back at the spookier claims and reminded readers that busy sea lanes always produce a steady number of mishaps that look like a cluster when you draw a small box around them. Those cautions did not have the stickiness of the new name. Bermuda Triangle could fit in a headline and stay there all day. What made the birth of the label so effective was its simplicity. It did not try to name a force or solve a riddle. It gave a boundary, a set of cases, and a question. That was enough. Once the phrase entered the language, it worked like a magnet on old clippings and family stories. People began to remember a cousin who had been on a freighter lost south of the Bahamas, or a pilot who said his compass once wandered near Bimini, and those memories were gathered under the new title. Librarians noticed a run on the same shelf. Mapmakers fielded letters from readers, asking why the triangle was not printed on charts. Travel agents learned which clients wanted the thrill of flying over it, and which wanted to go the long way around. By 1969, the triangle had moved from a clever headline to a cultural object. You could sketch it on a napkin, and everyone at the table would nod. That shift prepared the ground for what came next. The 70s would turn a neat phrase into a global bestseller and a television staple. The subject would go from magazine columns to thick paperbacks with color plates, from local talk in Florida bars to living rooms in London and Tokyo. What turned a clever phrase into a worldwide fixation was not a single event, but a stack of paperbacks and television hours that arrived in quick succession. In 1974, Charles Berlitz published a book with a plain title and a dramatic promise. The Bermuda Triangle gathered together old naval losses and recent aviation disappearances, stitched them with vivid transitions, and floated possibilities that ranged from magnetic riddles to visitors from somewhere else. It read easily, it sounded authoritative, and it sold in the millions. Airport kiosks stocked it beside crossword books. Commuters read it on trains. By Christmas that year, the triangle was no longer a South Florida curiosity. It was a global talking point. Berlitz wrote with a tone that carried the reader forward. He cited log entries, radio fragments, and press clippings, then paused to ask, "What if?" He pointed across the Atlantic to ancient myths and down to the seabed to imagined ruins. He did not claim to have proof. He offered a mood. That mood mattered. In the same decade, people were reading about ancient astronauts and lost continents. Television told them that science still had large unanswered questions. A neat triangle over busy seas gave the sense that wonder might live just offshore. Other authors spotted a market and hurried in. Richard Weiner brought out The Devil's Triangle and followed it with a documentary narrated by Vincent Price, whose velvet voice could make a grocery list sound ominous. Ivan Sanderson promoted the idea that the Earth hosted a dozen troubled zones he called vile vortices, with one of the largest over the western Atlantic. John Wallace Spencer filled pages with maps and photographs and suggested that the known cases might be only a fraction of the true total. Each book repeated the strongest stories and added a few more. Newspaper features echoed them. Weekend magazines ran cover art that showed airliners sliding beneath glossy waves while compasses spun in neat circles. None of this proved anything. All of it was sticky. Hollywood joined in with absolute sincerity. A television film called Beyond the Bermuda Triangle aired in the middle of the decade and delivered exactly what the title promised. The fantastic journey opened with a group lost near the triangle and then wandered into stranger places from there. Airport 77, a glossy studio picture, sent a jumbo jet into the sea near Bermuda and turned the rescue into an underwater spectacle. A low-budget feature simply called The Bermuda Triangle arrived near the end of the decade and packed in haunted ships, strange lights, and foreboding maps until the credits rolled. You did not need to see them all. Catching even one was enough to make you glance out the window the next time your flight crossed open water. The mania reached living rooms in quieter ways too. Leonard Nimoy hosted an episode of In Search of that explored the triangle with heaped seriousness. He stood in front of a chart and asked calm questions while ominous strings played. The reenactments showed cockpit crews squinting at compasses and fishermen pointing at whitecaps. The facts were mixed with suggestion, but the result was effective. Teachers reported students asking whether compasses really failed there, and whether ships could be swallowed whole without a trace. Encyclopedias that had never bothered with the triangle suddenly had short entries and cautious language. Toys and games followed as they always do. Milton Bradley sold a board game in which a plastic storm cloud prowled the sea and gobbled little freighters, a blunt lesson in currents delivered with cheerful malice. Puzzle books printed triangle-shaped mazes with tiny ships stranded inside. Travel brochures in Florida and Bermuda learned to mention the triangle in a single teasing sentence. Tour guides on harbor cruises pointed at the horizon, smiled, and let the pause do the work. Local institutions responded in their own ways. Museums near Fort Lauderdale curated displays on Flight 19 with careful captions and a touch of theater. The Coast Guard in Miami kept a sheaf of fact sheets handy for reporters. Pilots based in the islands learned to answer the triangle question with a shrug and a small lecture on weather and navigation. Insurance offices did not change their rates, a fact that quietly contradicted the headlines, but rarely made it into the last paragraph of the story. The decade also gave the legend new furniture. Artists painted charts with arrows that curved like question marks. Paperback covers showed ruined columns on the seabed and green lights under the waves. Magazine spreads sketched the sea floor as a set of traps, with trenches like open mouths and banks like teeth. The images were wrong in detail and right in spirit. They suggested a landscape with character. People remember landscapes with character. It is worth remembering how broad the audience had become. The triangle was now a subject that grandparents and teenagers could discuss over a kitchen table. One had read a sober article in a digest and quoted it. The other had stayed up late for a documentary and seen the reenactments. Each brought a piece of the same puzzle. The effect was cumulative. The more often a person encountered the triangle, the more fixed it felt. By the end of the decade, tour operators in Bermuda sold triangle cruises and T-shirts, and libraries kept the Berlitz book on a shelf that never gathered dust. There was pushback even then, mostly in small print. Skeptical magazine pieces reminded readers that storms and currents are good at hiding evidence, and that the supposed pattern looked less striking when you compared the triangle to other busy seas. Mariners wrote letters explaining how log entries get misread and how rumor improves with retelling. A librarian in Arizona published a painstaking book that checked case after case against original sources and found errors large and small. But the correction never catches up entirely with the story that charms. The 70s belonged to the charm. In the end, what the decade accomplished was simple. It took a handful of genuine losses and wrapped them in a narrative that was hard to resist. It created a geography that people could draw from memory. It gave a generation the habit of thinking of that patch of ocean as a character in its own right. The triangle moved from newsstands to the mental maps we carry around. Once that happens, the idea is very hard to remove. Once the triangle had a name, it did not take long for the imagination to move in with a trunk full of ideas. Some of them were old travelers' tales dressed in new clothes. Others were clever science words repurposed to carry a whiff of magic. The sea between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico became a stage for notions that could turn a quiet evening into an animated conversation. You could choose visitors from the sky, lost empires under the waves, time itself gone slightly wrong, or a planet with secret energy lines that misbehave in 12 unlucky zones. Most of these theories were light on evidence and heavy on personality, but they tell us a great deal about how people like their mysteries served. The extraterrestrial idea is the easiest to summarize. Strange lights are seen in many parts of the world. A handful have been seen over water. Some writers put one and one together and imagined aircraft or ships collected by someone from elsewhere. The proof on offer tended to be grainy photographs and recollections that grew vivid long after the event. As a story, it has grandeur. As an explanation, it offers nothing testable. Even so, the idea settled in the public mind because it satisfies a simple hunger. Big questions deserve big answers. If a bomber and a rescue plane can vanish on the same day, perhaps it is because a vast hand reached down. When you look back to the logbooks and the weather maps, the hand becomes a fog bank and a run of bad decisions, which is less satisfying at a party. Atlantis brought its own chorus. For readers of the 1970s, the sunken city felt freshly possible. Divers near Bimini found a tidy line of stone blocks in 1968, and the photographs found their way into popular books with captions that urged awe. Geologists who knew Bahamian beach rock explained that wave action naturally breaks and lays limestone into neat rows along ancient shorelines. The Bahamas have been building and reshaping beaches for a very long time. The more you learn about the place, the less it needs lost engineers with crystal machinery. The Bimini feature is a lesson in how quickly a familiar process can look like a monument if you view it from the right angle and add enthusiasm. A cousin to Atlantis is the idea of energy vortices or Earth grid nodes, favorite phrases in certain paperbacks of the period. The argument was that the planet hosts a set of powerful hotspots where magnetism or gravity bends slightly sideways, and that one of these sits under the western Atlantic. The problem is that the magnetism we measure there behaves just as it does elsewhere, apart from the ordinary map of declination that every navigator learns to correct. Gravity measurements show the expected variations for a region with deep trenches and piled-up carbonate banks. Nothing leaps out that would flip a compass or steal a ship whole. The map of supposed vortices is tidy, in a way nature rarely is, which is a clue that the hand holding the pencil cares more for symmetry than for data. Time slips and dimensional portals had their moment as well. Here the story goes like this. A vessel enters a mist or a ring of cloud, instruments whirl, and when it emerges, hours have gone missing or distance has collapsed. Pilots have reported real oddities. Static that makes needles jump. Temperature inversions that bend radar and radio in strange ways. A line of showers that creates a wall of grey where there was blue a minute before. Those are not doorways to other ages. They are reminders that the atmosphere is a busy place and that early avionics were not as calm as modern boxes. A good instructor can recreate a surprising number of these effects on a training flight without leaving the pattern. Now shift to the other side of the table, where people with clipboards and tide tables live. They do not ask what if. They ask what island. The first tool they reach for is the dullest one in the room. Statistics. If the triangle were truly exceptional, claims people make about it would show up in casualty rates. They do not. Insurance offices do not levy a surcharge on vessels that cross those latitudes. The Coast Guard points out that the area is busy and that busy places have more incidents simply because there are more attempts. When you adjust for traffic, the totals do not look out of line. This is the least romantic conclusion possible, which is why it never sits at the front of the book rack. Geography offers the next set of answers. The seafloor falls away sharply off Florida into the Blake Basin. To the south, the Puerto Rico Trench takes a sudden plunge to depths that swallow any hope of easy recovery. Tie that depth to a current that moves like a river, and you have a built-in vanishing trick that requires no wizard. Debris is there, and then it is not there. Oil films spread and fade. A life ring you could have found in a gentle bay at noon is far out of your search box by mid-afternoon. On the Bahama banks, the problem is the reverse. Vast shallows and coral heads punish any lapse in watchfulness. You can hurt a hull in water that looks like a swimming pool. Many of the most stubborn mysteries begin with this pair of facts. The bottom is very deep in one place and very shallow in the next. The current takes what floats, and the reefs take what does not. Weather supplies the third leg of the stool. In winter, cold fronts slide off the continent and meet warm water. That marriage produces energetic squalls and hard lines of wind. In summer, the trades pump up towers of cloud that build over the banks and then collapse into gusts and sheets of rain. Waterspouts walk across open water and behave for all the world like twisters, though with less fury. Microbursts descend from anvil clouds and send sharp winds outward along the surface in rings. None of this is exotic. All of it can ambush a pilot or a skipper who lets attention drift. The popular phrase air bombs made the rounds a few years ago with dramatic graphics of hexagonal clouds. Meteorologists rolled their eyes at the vocabulary and agreed about the physics. Downbursts are real. They do not need a new name, and they are entirely at home over warm ocean. Then there are waves. Not the charming rhythm you photograph at sunset, but the uncommon brutes that mariners once swore were legend until enough instruments caught them. Rogue waves are now part of the standard kit of ocean knowledge. These are steep and powerful walls that can double the height of the prevailing sea and that often arrive from an unexpected angle. They form when energy in a storm aligns and stacks on itself. Strong current helps by steepening the face. The western edge of the Gulf Stream is a laboratory where wind and current sometimes run against each other with enthusiasm. A cargo vessel or a small freighter that meets one of these at the wrong moment can take damage that cascades. Doors buckle, cargo shifts, the next wave finishes the story. If that happens near deep water, there may be nothing on the surface to find when the search begins. Cargo itself matters more than readers of thrillers tend to admit. Bulk cargoes can turn treacherous if loading is careless or if water gets where it should not. Ore, coal, grain, and powdered minerals can move as a mass inside a long hold. A list develops and worsens with every roll. A hull that would be safe with proper ballast becomes a riddle with a narrow path through a storm. The ore carriers that left the Caribbean in winter and did not arrive north deserve this kind of scrutiny before they receive any talk about portals. The tanker that carried molten sulfur in long heated tanks was a conversion with a known appetite for maintenance and a record of cracking. The sea is hard on long metal things. It is not required to provide an omen before it takes one. In the air, the list of practical causes is just as sturdy. Fatigue is powerful. A crew that has been up against a headwind at low altitude for hours is more likely to miss a small change in drift. Early radios were fussy, and early navigation aids required patience to interpret. A weak signal at the edge of coverage could be misread, and a frequency change at the wrong moment could leave two parties calling across each other. At night over water, the world outside the window can lose all texture. Pilots call it the black hole. Without a disciplined instrument scan, a descent can creep in and end the argument before a controller can turn the scope. The cases in which last words report a position close to land and then go silent are precisely the ones you would expect from a flight plan that has grown ragged by the end. The old business about compasses deserves a paragraph of its own. because it has confused readers for generations. A magnetic compass points toward magnetic north, which is not true north, and the difference is called declination. The line where that difference is zero is called the agonic line. It wanders. When it passes through a region, you can hold a compass and a chart and feel a pleasant agreement. When it does not, you must correct for the offset, which navigators have been doing for centuries. On days when the agonic line lay near Florida, an unwary pilot or sailor could feel confirmed when he should have been careful. On days when it did not, a tired crew that forgot to correct carried a small error along for hours until the shoreline was not where it should have been. There is no madness in the needle. There is only a patient rule about magnetism and our very human habit of skipping steps when the sky is busy. A few modern ideas are more intriguing than their cousins in the paperback shelves. Methane hydrates do exist in some sediments along continental margins. When disturbed, they can release bubbles that reduce water density and cause a hull to lose lift. Laboratory work shows the effect is real. Field evidence that links a specific loss in the Western Atlantic to a measured gas release is scarce. It stays in the file marked possible but not required. By contrast, our ability to find wrecks has changed the conversation entirely. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam maps, and small robotic vehicles have pulled back the curtain on stretches of seafloor that were blank for generations. Wrecks used as examples in early triangle books have been identified in ordinary places and returned to ordinary causes. The most persuasive tool is still the ledger. Agencies that collect data do not see a deadly box on the chart. They see a busy corridor with weather. When someone claims a special hazard, the experts ask how many ships and aircraft moved through without incident. The answer is millions. They ask how many of the headline cases came with fair warnings that did not make it into the third edition of the paperback. The answer is many. They ask whether the triangle line was drawn first and the dots placed inside later. The answer is that the line was very often the last thing added. Psychology ties the package with string. People love patterns. We also remember the striking loss and forget the humdrum save. Survivorship bias pushes solved cases out of the mystery book and leaves behind the ones with no debris and no voice. Confirmation bias keeps a news desk watching a region that already has a name and an eager audience. Amplification by repetition makes weak claims sound sturdy by the fifth retelling. None of this is sinister. It is how the human mind gets through a noisy world. The triangle story is less about a patch of water and more about the way we arrange and cherish uncertainty. This is not an argument for boredom. The real forces at work in the Western Atlantic have power and beauty. The Gulf Stream moves heat across a hemisphere. Hurricanes spin out of cloud and write their spiral on the sea. Coral banks grow cities of living stone and then recover from being shattered. Sailors look at the color of water and read 100 quiet signs. Pilots learn the smell of thick summer air and avoid it on days that seem harmless to the untrained. There is wonder enough in this without time tunnels and hidden batteries beneath the waves. The final tally is straightforward. The triangle gathered a crowd of theories because a handful of losses left no traces. The strongest of those theories are the ones that start with a chart and a weather map. They point to depth, current, wind, cargo, maintenance, instruments, and judgment. When you stack those in an unlucky hour, the file sometimes ends with no wreckage and a family that never learns more than a date. That is tragic. It is not supernatural. The better we have become at tracking, signaling, and searching, the smaller the mystery has grown. What remains is a compelling story about how we meet a difficult sea and about the ways we explain ourselves when the sea wins. The Bermuda Triangle did not become a household phrase by accident. It moved from Coast Guard reports and maritime registers into the living room because storytellers of every kind discovered that it worked on the page, on the screen, and even on a board laid out on a kitchen table. The transformation is a study in how an idea travels once it has a memorable name, a simple shape you can draw on a napkin, and a handful of haunting cases that will not quite explain themselves. Books led the parade. Charles Berlitz's bestseller in the 1970s put the triangle on every airport rack and gave casual readers their first tour of missing ships and silent airliners. His chapters moved briskly from logbooks to what-ifs, and for a time that tone was exactly what people wanted. A counterpoint arrived almost immediately. Librarian Larry Couchet spent years digging into original sources and produced a book that treated the triangle as a catalogue of reporting errors, weather, and human frailty. The two volumes sat on the same shelves and gave the public a choice between wonder and paperwork, both sold, that is, culture at work. Television multiplied the reach. Documentary hours dressed the triangle in moody music and reenactments that made cockpit calls sound like theater. In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, presented the subject with grave calm and gave a generation its first moving pictures of the basic cases. News magazines ran their own segments and kept the idea fresh with anniversary pieces. The story jumped to drama as well. You could watch a primetime film in which a jet sank into calm water and a daring rescue unfolded beneath the surface. An episode of a long-running series sent an FBI agent into a vintage liner lost in a strange pocket of time near Bermuda. Science fiction films nodded to Flight 19 by returning its pilots as if they had stepped away and come back the same day. None of this proved the existence of anything beyond bad luck and deep water, but it made the triangle feel like a place with personality. Music and radio did their share. Pop songs used the name as shorthand for vanishing love or for a stretch of life where plans go missing. Call-in shows hosted evenings on the mysteries of the sea and soon learned that the triangle could keep a phone bank lit until midnight. Comedians joined in and turned the phrase into a gentle punchline. A lost sock was said to have gone to the Bermuda Triangle of the laundry. An office that swallowed paperwork became the Bermuda Triangle of accounting. When an idea makes that jump into jokes, it is no longer just a claim. It is a cultural tool. Children met the triangle through toys and maps. Milton Bradley sold a board game in which a roaming storm cloud removed ships from the board with a satisfying clack. Puzzle books printed triangle mazes with tiny freighters stranded inside. Library encyclopedias that had once ignored the subject now included short entries with careful language about currents and storms. Teachers used the story in lessons on critical thinking. One side of the handout was the dramatic retelling of a disappearance. The other side was an accident report written in brisk prose. Students learned how editing and mood can change the shape of a fact. Tourism found a tone that mixed theater with hospitality. In Bermuda, tour boats traced short arcs to the edge of the reef, while guides told stories that began with history and ended with a wink. Shorefront shops sold shirts and mugs with tidy red triangles. A cocktail with 3 rums and a suggestive name appeared on menus from Nassau to Miami. Museums near Fort Lauderdale set up cases about Flight 19 with artifacts and photographs, and docents learned to answer questions that zigzagged between aviation procedure and folklore. Local Coast Guard stations kept printed sheets near the front desk that explained how search boxes move in a running current. The triangle even shaped how video games and comics imagined the ocean. Adventure titles marked it on their maps as a zone where radio fails and missions go wrong. Comic book heroes sailed through it on their way to Lost Islands and revisited it whenever a writer needed a dramatic detour with an old-time flavor. The details rarely matched geography, but the symbol was too useful to leave alone. Put a red triangle on blue water, and you have a plot device ready to go. As the years passed, the story aged into a steady rhythm of claims and replies. The Coast Guard and NOAA published accessible notes that answered the most common questions. They explained the Gulf Stream and the steep drop of the continental shelf. They pointed to long records that do not show a higher rate of loss than other busy seas. Skeptical writers returned every so often to recheck the famous cases against original sources and to correct myths that had grown with retelling. None of that stopped the triangle from showing up in new places. When a streaming platform needed a series that mixed history with a hunt, a crew of divers went looking for wrecks under the banner of cursed waters. When a podcast host looked for topics that combine atmosphere with unresolved questions, the triangle rose to the top of the list again. Local culture absorbed the legend in quieter ways. Small marinas in South Florida keep memorial plaques for crews who did not return. Air shows near the old Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale include nods to the training squadrons that once flew out over the banks and never came back. Fishermen tell matter-of-fact stories about the current that will move a buoy a mile while you are looking at it. Pilots out of Miami practice saying "fly west" with no drama in their voices. To people who work there, the triangle is not a thrill. It is a set of conditions that reward attention. Advertising did not miss the chance. Travel copywriters learned that a single sentence about the mysterious triangle made readers pause. Car commercials used the phrase as a metaphor for a model that defies the ordinary. Even cereal boxes once ran a small maze that sent a cartoon boat past a cartoon whirlpool and asked the reader to bring everyone home. Once you train your eye, you see the name everywhere. The most interesting shift is how the triangle moved into classrooms as an example of how myths grow. Professors who teach media studies use it to show how a label can gather scattered events and make them look like a pattern. In science classes, it serves as an exercise in reading primary sources. In psychology, it anchors discussions on confirmation bias. The same shape that once invited talk of aliens now teaches students how to argue from evidence. That is an odd and cheerful evolution. Through all of this, the place itself has not changed. Ships still depart and arrive. Airliners pass over at regular intervals that would make an astronomer happy. When a modern loss does happen inside the old lines, the story briefly returns to the front page. It is usually resolved with a cause that fits the ordinary record of sea or sky. The legend breathes a little and settles back. The culture keeps the triangle on its shelf because it is useful and because it is fun to talk about. It lives as a metaphor for vanishing and as a case study in how media can turn real hazards into a brand. If you want to watch the Ark in a single day, walk from a museum case about Flight 19 to a shop that sells shirts with a red shape on blue cloth, then sit on a bench and listen to a guide greeting a tour group with a story that starts in the age of sail and ends with a smile. Somewhere between those stops, you will find a newsstand with a headline about a new documentary and a library with both Berlitz and Coucher in the catalogue. That is the triangle as culture. Not a line on a chart so much as a loop that runs from story to souvenir, to sober footnote, and back again. In the end, the Bermuda Triangle is less a riddle than a reminder. Currents run, weather turns, and people set out anyway because work and hope and curiosity send them. Some never return, and the sea keeps its silence, while searchers keep looking and the rest of us keep telling the tale. Perhaps that is the lasting mystery here. Not a secret force, but the way a busy corner of ocean became a story we cannot stop sharing.